Hey, how you guys doing? Good to see you. Let's see. Oh, two people. Nabil is watching. Nice, 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 nice. Nabil, are you on the way already? Have a good flight. I usually wait for a quorum of about three to what do you call it? 3 to 5 is my quorum. Then I just start. Is my audio okay, by the way? Oburu, Daddy. Now I can start. The honorables are here. Oburu, where you tuned in from? Just put it out in the chat, huh? So I can have a look at it. Just giving it about 5 minutes. Always respect the people who come first. So usually I wait until about 5 past, and then I start yakking. Buru, I spoke to your friend who was in Rotterdam. He was very gracious. He sent me a note. He's coming home tomorrow. What is his name again? Patrick. Yeah, Patrick was in Rotterdam for about 3 days, huh? So he's coming back tomorrow. So, yeah, it'd be nice to meet him in the flesh, but he seemed to have had a good time in the Netherlands. Yeah. Cedric, welcome. Okay, for me that's quorum. Usually I say when there's 3 people, the conversation. Because if you're with 3 people around the table, that's a lot of people already. So guys, thank you so much for, first of all, just keeping time, for joining me on this live. I've kind of lost count on how many lives I've done now, but they're quite regular. This is the second one on Facebook though. I first started out with Instagram. Then I realized all the Zakes on this other side on Facebook, so I decided to kind of switch territory so I can hang out with you guys. A lot of my generation, Gen Xers, live on Facebook. Huh? Instagram is interesting, it's got its highlights, but I also like Facebook because it's kind of just old school in that way. Yeah, so what's the news? The reason I'm doing this live is because, excuse me, sorry, I have published a book. In case you're wondering, there we go. Beautiful cover, I must say. Strength and Sorrow is the name of the book, is the title of the book. Nabil, who I met for the first time today at Schiphol Airport, managed to get a copy of his own. I hope to come home soon. I'll announce my dates so that I can get a chance to literally sign copies, meet people, talk to people, get reviews. And more importantly, just to kind of give my thanks and just say, hey man, you know what? It's been nice, it's been real. It's been quite a journey, culminating to a finished product. I started writing this book about 3 years ago. It started out as a completely different project. The original title I had was something called The Men We Lost. The idea was to look at all the important male figures and then basically document all of the kind of obituaries I'd written over the years, and then document and extract lessons from each one of them. That was the whole idea. And then as life happens, life happens was making great plans. I had a couple of personal tragedies in the family, and it changed the focus. So when I originally started writing Strength and Sorrow, I was writing almost like as somebody who writes obituaries. You have a nice detached distance. You're looking at things over there. You're analyzing from far. And then, of course, as I said, death knocked home. Knocked our actual door, and it blew that open. And I was forced to then confront it. And in confronting my own grief, I realized how much I'd been masking, how much evasion there was. And luckily, I had the tool of the pen as a journalist and as a writer. And then I used that to basically get into it. Mama T, good to see you. Welcome. So that's the whole thing. So today's topic was kind of inspired by, the book has been out since the 8th of September. And then the whole idea came out of, as I started, of course, what happens. You take a book out there, typically as a writer, you're biting your nails, you're wondering how the book will be reviewed, what people think of it. Fortunate for me, I still haven't had any big reviews, but the reviews that have come through are quite decent, and are quite resonant in that way. So people basically are reflecting on what the stories have meant for them. And ultimately, for me, that's what a book is supposed to do. A lot of the books I've read, a lot of all my favorite writers, the reason why I like them so much is because their stories reflect back on me. One of my favorite writers is a guy called Anton Chekhov, the famous Russian short story writer. And Chekhov was writing in the late 1880s, He's writing about literally life in Moscow, Russia of that era, the Prussian area. And I find Chekhov ridiculously relatable. In fact, of the writers, he's been one of the biggest influences of my writing. I would say the two, George Orwell and Anton Chekhov, have had about the biggest influences. George Orwell largely because of his writing life, because he was also a journalist and as a man who was literally in the trenches, and how he spoke to society. So originally we all started out by admiring George Orwell, because we're introduced to George Orwell largely through the Animal Farm. And then by the time you read 1984, the man's legacy is just basically cemented. But then, of course, I found this Anton Chekhov. And the reason why I found Chekhov quite interesting, because he's writing about the same era as, for example, Charles Dickens is, and Charles Dickens, the famous Tale of Two Cities. But Chekhov is quite interesting for me, because Chekhov was doing really short stories. He didn't have any grand, big scenes. But the reason I found Chekhov really relatable, and you should really check him out, Anton Chekhov, if you like short stories. The reason I found Chekhov really relatable was that Chekhov was speaking to human condition, So if you got over the exterior, the things that were happening, and looked at what exactly was happening on the inside, in that way Chekhov revealed a lot about the human condition, and the human condition is universal. So when I started writing this book, that's exactly what I was trying to do. I was trying to say that the personal, or rather the local, is global. The personal is universal. So, which is why I don't know who said, the famous saying is that until there's justice for, I think it was Martin Luther, I believe, MLK, until there has to be justice for all of this, justice for nobody. That whole idea of the personal is the universal. So That's the approach at which I've kind of I've taken on this book. That I'm hoping that my personal story then reflects on your own and holds a mirror back for you to be able to basically examine your story better. That's the gist of it. So that's what I'm kind of trying to get into today. How your stories of grief have basically what they're teaching me, and how it's kind of just expanding my world, you know? Because you think you're done with the story, but then a story keeps on giving and giving. And as soon as somebody gives you their own reflection, you reflect back on your own, and your story in a way expands. So if you follow my page, Alex, by the way, welcome. Good to see you. If you follow my page, by the way, guys, this just I sort of forgot to explain some house rules. These lives are basically very, as I say, the ambaka, as we say in Dulu, wagombaka, you know, gumzo. So they're not very structured. I rely a lot on the interaction. So if you ask me kind of questions, you have thoughts, things come out, just kind of put them in the chat, and I'll kind of try and respond to them, and we'll see how it goes. I largely engage in a lot of storytelling, anecdotes from my life, but I love it also when I'm responding to people, because sometimes I'm just talking to myself on a screen. But if you guys kind of just, you know, if you have a comment, something that strikes you that I'm saying, you think you want to kind of pipe in, just put it in the comments, and then I'll kind of respond to it, and I'll answer it. If perhaps you already have the book, and you've read something, and something struck you about the book, or some story struck you, and you want to ask more about it, feel free to kind of just put a comment there, and I'll try and get into them. So the title for this live, the original title, of course, was What Your Stories of Grief Are Teaching Me. And I've had a lot of triggers in terms of people telling me their stories, but I want to read one in particular. And if you go to my Facebook page, if you follow my Facebook page, you will find it in the thread, like from about 2-3 days ago. And the story was by a guy, an incredible writer. He's called, let me get his name actually, Okoth. What's Omondi? Omondi Ochuka, which I find is a really cool name. Omondi Ochuka. You know, as you guys know, Ochuka is a name that has a place in our history, you know. So Omondi Ochuka did a really beautiful reflection on Medium. I don't want to kind of spoil it all, but it's all in his it's on the page on my Facebook page. It's a whole story. But this is the part I want to read. This is what I found really intriguing. He says a lot of beautiful things, but this is the part I want to read and then perhaps delve into a little bit and see what we can extract. So he says, because he's also got his own memoir. Leslie Karibisana, good to see you. And he says, what unites me, Paula, and countless others is the recognition that illness in this part of the world is a systemic trauma. It's a nation they invested in life. Every Baba in Nairobi knows the truth. We are too poor to afford sickness. Every funeral committee in Kisumu or Kilifi rehearses the same contradiction that money will be found for death and never for treatment. Every hospital corridor whispers the same aphorism. I can't pronounce that word. Aphorism. Life is a gambled right. Paula got writing margins of my own philosophy. Illness is the nation's most honest mirror. A death certificate is also a budget sheet. Funerals are our theater of denial. Every prolonged hospital stay is a silent referendum on the family solidarity. Ashes are not an end. They are simply a compressed autobiography. Strength and Sorrow, this is what he writes. Strength and Sorrow is a treatise in disguise. It's about us and our broken healthcare, costly grief, and the sticky insistence on dignity in death. Against my memoir, precursor, I realize that illness has been both my antagonist and my tutor. It has stripped me, delayed me, suspended me, and also forced me into thought, care, writing, and this deeply present pulse. Closing this reflection, I think of Nyangi's ashes, who is my sister, Baba's grave, J. Nikki India, the Baba needing Palace scalp, Achieng Abura's failed fundraiser, and the hospital wards where people cough themselves into eternity. Kenya as a nation of patience. Our griefs are excellent elegies, and our memoirs are medical records. The continuation of illness only changes form. Now, this is I mean, of course, you have to read the whole article to get it. Huh? Leslie Karibu, good to see you. AI with NG, good to see you. I think I've seen you again. Welcome back. So, what Omondi Ochuka is writing about here, and this is something another writer, a really good writer called Kinyanjui Kombani, beautiful Kenyan writer, writes as well. He said this about his books, that sometimes as a writer you write something and then people tell you stuff about your book that you didn't even realize you were saying because they reflect something different make a different impression on the guy reading the story. So one of the things that now in reflection after reading Omondi Ochuka's thing is that all of my stories are tied down to this tragedy of illness. People getting sick, and as soon as they get sick, as in when sickness persists, start to plan a funeral. That's kind of the metaphor in Kenya. And I started realizing it is the connecting thread. If you looked all around us, it's the one thing that literally connects every Kenyan, the tragedy of sickness. If you have a parent, if you have a partner, if you have children, and they get into that difficult situation, you look at largely a lot of our funerals around somebody fell sick and they didn't make it. Now the irony of it is this, is the person, especially those people who have like terminal diseases, and Omondi has an experience with his own, when you have things like cancer, and you have all of these other illnesses that are kind of terminal and that have a prolonged stay in the hospital. What happens is that it's amazing how quickly people get exhausted. So you can do one round of fundraising and people changa, but the moment you are in hospital for over a month and the bill starts shooting past 1 million and above, suddenly there's a fatigue. You might have a few dedicated family members, but they're doing it literally out of obligation. But for most people, there's a fatigue. The funny thing is this, the moment the person who was ill dies, the generosity is amazing. Everybody's then suddenly just tunatoa. The M-Pesa mchangos are just growing. You put a budget there, before you know it, you read that budget without a problem. That contradiction is something that I try and talk about, it's something I write about. One of the classic cases I write about in the book was from a story that I originally read from another Kenyan writer known as Jackson Biko. And Biko writes about Achieng' Abura. If you guys remember Achieng' Abura, the amazing, glorious voice. The woman who could, man, I could have been dare imitate that voice, like a deep, beautiful voice, Achieng' Abura. So Achieng' Abura then went through, of course, some medical challenges, and she was hospitalized for a long period. And they tried to do a fundraiser where they got together all of the big names, So we're talking about Macadame, you're talking about Susanna Wio, like the big names came through, especially in the kind of African folk music. And they could hardly raise any money. But the moment Achieng' kind of succumbed to her illness, suddenly the outpouring was incredible. The generosity was incredible. I was having a conversation earlier today with a guy called Nabil, who was one of the guys who just kind of bought my book. And we met at the airport on his way back home. And we started reflecting. And we said, this is a very interesting peculiarity about Kenyans. And I started saying, anybody from my generation, this is us Gen Xers, guys born in the 70s, the one thing we distinctly remember was that every time there would be what we called an harambe, like a fundraiser, is that it was supposed to be things like for people going abroad, people going overseas for education. That's what harambes were known for. And they're really quite common. So you'd have people then raising money for somebody being sent abroad. And that's back in the day, if you remember the pictures, anybody from that generation can remember, there'd always be this truckloads of people going to the airport to wave somebody goodbye. you know? And it's a tradition that starts with, so the airlift from the days, you know, the famous airlift of Tom Mboya that had the likes of like Barack Obama's father going, the original Obama, going, you know, all of the greats, you know, Wangari Maathai. Remember that famous picture, they have it, of, you know, people standing on the stairs towards the plane and waving back at the crowd? That used to be the thing. People would have a Harambee, a fundraiser, for school fees to send people out for education. And one of the consistent things you used to find in everybody's home was the picture of the educated son or woman with her, you know, with a graduation gown on. That's what Harambes used to be about. Try and remember in the present day, within the last decade or so, the last time you saw a fundraiser for schooling. It's very rare now. What we see now very consistently is fundraisers, not even for medical, hardly. Appeals go out, you know, but you always know they always fall short. But the one thing that is consistent is fundraisers for grief, you know, for funerals. If you're by my age, at least, those of us who are now much older, at least every other month, you're going to be included in a WhatsApp group for a fundraiser for somebody who has passed. That's the reality we're dealing with. So in a way, grief has become kind of like a unifying factor, something that basically holds us together. So in essence, we are a country that's actually grieving, in essence. And the one thing that is our foundation, the one thing that we're all afraid of, and because we have a healthcare that doesn't hold us all, and it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, you know, the one thing that equalizes all is illness. Because illness doesn't matter who you are. You know what I mean? You could afford to fly to South Africa or the UK. It doesn't mean your recovery is guaranteed. So this is kind of the stuff I explored, and it was very interesting to hear Omondi Ochuka, the thing that I just read you, reflect back on that. You know, there's a part I'd like to read again, and it says it's something I was reading, and it's, oh yeah, there it is. Okay. So it says, it's funny when you read your own name. Pala calls Kenya a nation of the walking dead. He's not exaggerating. The metaphor works because it names an invisible epidemic of the way sickness and death stalk families as biological inevitabilities and systemic failures. For the ordinary citizen, you live perpetually close to both the grave and the auction block. Ooh, that's powerful. That's powerful. And he reflects this that was prompted by something I write midway through the book. And this is what he says. He says, Paulo records a conversation with his barber. And I remember some barber I used to have in Nairobi West. I forget his name though, but he very, very steady barber. And as the guy was, you know, this is back in the days before this famous masseuse came into barbers where unashiko kila mahali. The good old days, man. Just you and your guy, and the most you could get is just like a head, kufinya kwa kichwa, you know, scalp massage. That was about it, man. All of this fancy stuff that I hear about these days, you know, your hands being rubbed and all of that stuff. That wasn't there. Barbershops were serious places where we had serious conversations. Nonetheless, so this barber is kneading my scarf, and he confesses, people are too poor to afford falling ill. In Kenya, sickness is both biological and financial. The body's failure is a household's failure. Private hospitals are out of reach. Public hospitals are death traps. If one survives, it's the cost of sliding into financial ruin. Better, as the barber insists, to have a quick death. So this barber was telling me, but you know, sometimes, you know, this is like about 5 years ago, nothing has really changed, you know? But he's saying me, if I fall sick, man, it's a 50-50 gamble. 50-50. Because the chances of me landing in Nairobi hospital or a hospital that can really cater for me is, where's the chums? You know, because people know themselves, you know, clearly too. Where's the chums? And the thing is that even if I land in those hospitals, but let's say it's an emergency, a medical emergency, that there's no way it can be held back, is that the financial cost will basically rule the family. So in a way, you find cases where people actually wish somebody would die, actually as an act of mercy. This is kind of the quagmire we're dealing with sometimes. And sometimes it's easy to kind of look at these things as a problem that happens to people over there. But anybody who has, for example, aging parents or who has dealt with a kind of terminal illness within the family, if you have a child, like, for example, who's special needs, or if you have, or if you have of somebody of close relation who has, cancer, leukemia, one of these diseases that require a lot of medical, lupus, a lot of medical attention, that's when you realize how fragile life is. And this is what we're trying to explore. So if you've just joined us, I've seen a couple of people here. Liz, welcome. Michael, good to see you. So I'm reflecting on responses to my book, my first book. I was about to say my latest. My first book, which is called Strength and Sorrow, Reflections on the One with Loss, my meditations on grief, loss, dying, bereavement, and disposal. And the thing that really sparked this live was people are now reflecting back on what my story is telling them about their own stories. And I'm kind of reflecting back, for those who caught me midway, I was talking about just how we reflect on illness and the space that illness holds in our psyche as a country. The rules of the game in this live is just basically a conversation. I don't really have a grand agenda here. The idea is just to talk, to get into the book, for you to actually get a chance to ask me any questions. I want to start off by taking one question that was put down by Alex. By the way, if you have any questions, please just, do the needful. Put it in the comments. I'll look at it and respond to it right away. So, Alex, I guess it's a comment. He says, in the Luo culture, we glorify death more than life. Orphans and widows are always suffer after a mega funeral feast. Now, of course, I unpack this completely, without saying too much, trying to get you guys to read the book. But I unpack this completely in the sense of that we are stuck with the ceremonial aspect of the show, the spectacle. But the essence of what we call the traditional and spiritual practice of what it takes to escort somebody for the transition of the end of life is something that's completely lost. The irony of our funeral process, and especially for those of us in Western Kenya, where it's a little bit more exaggerated, is that you're now looking at the average funeral, and this is not an exaggeration, the average funeral is costing up to 1 million. Kenya shillings, by the way. I'm not talking about UG cash. 1 million, 1 meter, as my nephew would say. 1 meter. Which is going to be blown in what? In 2 weeks. And it's not like that 1 meter has been invested in, I don't know, a college fund or a school fund or some housing or, paying rent for the next 6 months. Nay. It's to cater for largely 2 days. 2 days. Friday when the body arrives and Saturday, and of course the other expenses. So we've got into this kind of, and it's very kind of paradoxical in a way. Paradoxical. Let me try and explain. In this way, on one hand, there's a kind of collective communalism that this celebration brings. We celebrate. The problem, though, is the spectacle. And as Alex rightly points out, there's a kind of almost glorification of where, and hence why Omondi's article was so beautiful, in the sense of somebody could be in hospital dying, and people not even asking you to, because if people came together, the whole point of the Harambee was that all of us would come together, kidogo kidogo ujaza kibaba, haba na haba basically, small here, and collectively would find some money. But these days, because of kind of how the healthcare system has basically just been privatized and collapsed, essentially, is that the average hospital bill, you're almost embarrassed to even throw in 1,000 bob there. You're like, man, it's 250 a night. You're like, I can only spare 1,000 bob. It's almost embarrassing. It's so embarrassing the fact that people even decide not to give at all, almost out of a shame that they don't have enough. It happens also sometimes in funeral collection tallies. And why I know in particular funerals where they start saying, you know what we'll do? We won't put the amounts. We'll put the names, but we won't put the amounts. Just so people can get over the embarrassment. We have come from an era where when a funeral happened, you brought whatever you could bring, Some people brought their own chicken. Some people brought stuff from the farm, You know, some people just brought themselves in terms of their labor and their presence. All that has basically collapsed, and what will have remained is the spectacle of the funeral. And the problem with it is that it's become obligatory. It's like, it has to be. Forget about everything else, but it has to be live streamed. It has to meet all of those standards. Only the spectacle. And as soon as it's over, the family, the most bereaved, are basically left to figure it out. This is the challenge of our society, and this is what I try deeply to interrogate in this book. And I take examples from my own funeral processes, the first encounters of major death that I came about. I'm talking about like my dad, you know, the first time I actually saw the spectacle of a funeral and what it meant. Yeah. So I'd like to kind of respond to some questions. You know how this works. Just put your stuff in the comment. If something triggers you, just be loose about it. You know, it's just really a conversation. So, so it's two questions here. One is from AI with NG. I'll just call you NG. And then there's another comment here from Leslie. Let me start with NG. NG says, as I was walking back home today, I saw a girl about 20 years of age who is suffering from cerebral palsy. 1 second, let me read the rest of it. What's that happening there? Fat fingers. There we go. And then I wondered, she must be a survivor. I wonder how the parents managed to raise their daughter till that point. Let me land this plane reiterating what you said about the healthcare is expensive. Yeah, I suppose I get what you're saying, NG. You know, it's like, really for parents and partners, and not just parents, partners, you know, also sometimes it's children who are taking care of their ailing and aging parents. Man, it's a hell of a sacrifice. It's a hell of a sacrifice. It's a hell of a commitment. Hell of a commitment. Sometimes you wish you would have the collective support of everybody else, but we're in a country that's completely distressed. The people have barely enough to take care of their own. Forget about taking care of the next. Also, the collective ethic is largely gone. We become very individualized. I grew up at a time when we look at now the small houses that we grew up in, those houses were always full. The typical house always had a double-decker. Now, in our quote-unquote prosperous lives, my daughters sleep in their own rooms. Now, that was unheard of. It was completely unheard of. If you reach a certain level of life, you had to support. This is what we call it. We see it as black tax. We even have a name for it, black tax. And it's something that's completely discouraged. Yes, there's elements about it that are completely exploitative. You know, people just exploiting you, you know. But there used to be an Utu element about it that was lost along the way, you know, where the people literally used to support each other. The fact that somebody moves into a city, they bring the next person in, and they support each other through the ranks. All of that is lost. What it has been replaced with is this individualism that plays out at every level, including the most important process of our lives, which is our end-of-life process. Leslie has got a question for me. Please, man, feel free to put your comments, and that will make this thing really interesting. Huh? How does that compare to the European experience? You know, one of the shockers, I'm based in the Netherlands, huh? And one of the shockers, because I came here just around the COVID time, and the thing that really surprised me, really surprised me, is that I'm looking at the numbers, tallying the numbers, and I know people are dying in this country. I know the Sodieros are dying. You can see the numbers, you know, COVID is happening. You can see the numbers. But I can't see any funeral processions. So I don't get a sense of, I'm not getting a sense of what's happening. And literally in those 2 years of COVID, I only saw 2 hearses, 2. And literally by default, you know, one I was in my house, looking out of the window, back window, and I see a hearse. Another one, I'd gone to pick up my daughter in one of those play centers that you take kids to in this part of the world. And I saw a hearse. And in both hearses, it was literally the family and the guys catering for the funeral. Like, so literally, there's a whole catering industry around death. So your people die, and because it's all covered by insurance, you literally hand over. You literally hand over and somebody just comes and takes care of the whole process. And you're just given a schedule of what to follow. That's how it is. This whole thing of a Tumati comes together and we sit down and we say, okay, is the main uncle here? What are we going to do? Nani na nani. Leslie bado yuko Europe. Atakuja siku gani? That kind of thing. How much money do you know? Who's going to buy the funeral? Who's going to buy the coffin? Who's going to toa ng'ombe if you're a jango? Who's taking out the bull? All of those things, nada. Because it's all down to basically a bureaucracy that is taken care of by somebody else. Now, there's two ways to look at it. On one hand, it takes, because it's already catered for, you know, insurance, it's your money, it's already been catered for. It takes a lot of pressure off the family, you know. So you don't have that suddenly family of like, damn, you've got a funeral expense that basically carves out a whole bunch of your income. You know, it becomes a really big outlay. Yeah. But on the other hand, it's completely divorced from the communalness. It's just basically sanitized. It's like we're disposing garbage. It's like we're disposing. It's literally, in fact, even in the death studies, they call it death, dying, and disposal. Disposal. Literally, what do we do with this carcass? And the experts come, and it's very professional, and it's very removed. So it's very interesting to see that other side of the death industry here. Like how removed people were from, like somebody, like just as recently here as literally last week, a friend of mine loses his mother-in-law. This is a really good friend of mine with African roots. And he tells me, first of all, he tells me in passing, you know, we're talking about something else, and he's like, oh, by the way, I should let you know that my partner's mother just died. And I'm like, oh, sorry, man, can we, I'm doing the African thing. What do we do? Where are we meeting? What do you need? I don't know. Can I bring some food? Can I bring some flowers, maybe? Something. The guy's like, no, I'll inform you. The next time he sends me a text, he says, oh, by the way, it was a beautiful funeral. It was done like in 3 hours. And the guy's done. And the social custom here is that when somebody is grieving, you give them space. The exact opposite of us. The worst thing you can do to somebody in our culture when they're grieving is to leave them alone. We gather. We gather. That's why we know where all our relatives live. We might not see them all our lives, but as soon as there's a tragedy, all of us travel, including those in the diaspora. People travel. We gather. Here's the exact opposite. People give each other space. So there's that. It was a bit of a culture shock in the beginning, and then the bureaucracy of death was also a bit of a culture shock, where even as close relatives, and I've had another experience, and I write about this in the book as well, of where we lost a niece. It was a kind of a very tragic family affair because it was a grandmother, a mother, and a niece died within a kind of short period. So technically, the niece was the last in the chain. And there was a father, but it was an estranged father, a father who basically had not been in my niece's life. But when she died, according to the bureaucracy of that country, and in this particular country was the Swedish bureaucracy, is the father had more rights than we, the family members. So here we are watching a process where our niece remains are being handled by a father who hadn't been in her life for the better part, and we had no way of getting involved. This is the bureaucracy of death. And this is now the contradiction of societies, which is why sometimes it's really important to interrogate your own customs. And even as you evolve, as you make changes, because as you get older, those of us who now become parents, we're the ones who are setting forth the tradition. How we bury is based on how we watch our fathers bury, is how we watch our grandfathers bury. And the beat goes on. So in a way, you've got to be very aware of the responsibility you have for those coming behind you. How you behave in matters of death is you basically setting tradition in stone, setting custom. Pay attention. That's why these things are very important. Deborah has a question for me, or rather a comment. Deborah is saying, Deborah. My grandmother's called Deborah. We actually have funeral bloggers. People who attend funerals. Oh, damn, I didn't know this. We actually have funeral bloggers. People who attend funerals and give reviews on how posh it was, who attended, and the quality of the food. It's crazy. It's crazy. It's nuts. I'm telling you, it's nuts. It's madness. You know, I mean, I could talk about this for like properly. You know, one of the things I ended up, and part of the reason why I don't know, I ended up with a lot to say about this subject, is that as a result of, I guess, my age and my upbringing, I became very involved in the funeral process. And not the kind of, you know, I don't know, you pay your money and then you show up on the day of the funeral, but you know, the actual planning, the actual logistics, and then somehow, I don't know, family, for some one reason or another, we had a lot of deaths in the family, you know, around the larger family. So you get quite involved, and it's funny the way life shifts. Because on one moment, you're just a young man who's been sent around. A few years later, you look around and you realize, damn, we are the elders. Everybody's looking at you and saying, oh, you know, what are we going to do? Like, what's the plan? And you see, there's no warning, there's no initiation, there's no planning. It just suddenly descends, and suddenly you turn around and you realize, damn, it's we to make the decisions. Now, one of the most frustrating things about being in a funeral committee, for anybody who's been in a funeral committee before, is when you start to put down a budget and some random rela shows up and gives some random ridiculous expense out of nowhere. And before you know it, we have a budget because people are saying, oh, by the way, we need t-shirts for every day. Oh, by the way, we need branded. It's almost like comparative. Because it happened in somebody else's funeral, we also must have that. And under the guise, because it's always under the guise, and you can't hard to argue against this, is to respect my mother. It's in honor of my blah, 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 blah. So what happens is that funerals have been reduced to spectacles. Where in the old days, for example, in a village, where everybody used to come in and support, and the people who actually bereaved would even have to cook. These days, the people just come to spectate and watch, you know, like, and literally judge you on the quality of the food, on how people are dressed, on how the speeches were. But the whole spectacle of loss, the whole tragedy of loss, the whole communalness of grief, that's absent. This is what I think, this is my opinion, personal opinion, this is what I think we need to challenge. This is what we need to challenge, because it's becoming quite ridiculous, if you ask me. For all the people who have joined us, Mark Adero, welcome. William Talbot, welcome. Adhiambo Wendy, welcome. Mark has a comment I'd like to get into. He says, African cultures seem to be self-destructing. Even professors still stick to them. Look at the home setup in Luo, each son his own, and then everyone is expected to leave. How does that truly bring unity? Okay, let me get into that because it's a little bit nuanced. But let me try. On one hand, and trust me, if you live in a Western culture, you'll understand that all cultures are basically corrosive, you know? And all cultures have a way of that. They're negatives, you know? If you speak to an average Dutchman, you speak to an average European right now, the one thing all of Europe is saying, basically all of the white people are saying, is, oh, our culture has been eroded. The threat of this immigration scare. So it naturally happens. The nature of modernity, cultures erode. There's a context, and I think I need to correct this for you, Adero, is that cultures are dynamic. They evolve, you know? They're always evolving. Which is why I'm saying now for us as a people, we're the ones basically defining the culture. 30, 40 years from now, when people are describing, for example, the Luo, they'll be talking about people like us. What is our behavior? Oh, we were guys of bespoke. We were guys of, pesotas. These are just cultures that are quite recent, that have basically, they started out with cultures of basically coming from places of basically pride, in a sense of pride in terms of real achievement, to pride that is basically just attached to purely materialism. So cultures evolve, right? Ultimately, within the cultural code, the unity was already coded. What has happened though with culture sometimes is that we tend to emphasize a lot in negativity. And this is one of the real big problems of modernity. Because modernity always looks at African cultural practices through its lens. So for example, if you look at the lens of, and specifically, because this touches on masculinity, which is a subject that I write quite frequently about, is that the whole idea of a man moving from his father's homestead was basically initiation into manhood. The idea was for you basically to be your own man. because you had to detach from your mother's influence in order for your wife and your family to thrive on their own. The assumption at the time, of course, there was enough land for everybody else. What has happened now is because there's hardly any land that allows us to expand, the culture has to evolve. The fact that people have not evolved is our crisis. You can apply that to our death rituals, right? The original death rituals, like for example, if you look at the expense, the money that goes into the death ritual, was born out of the fact that it was Utu, it was collectivism. The fact that somebody died, typically, and if you look and speak specifically about the Luo culture, specifically within the Luo culture, when somebody died, there was no fire that should be burning in the home. The neighbors were supposed to bring in food. That was the idea. You were just supposed to stay bereaved. Everybody brings in food and they take care of you. The in-laws come from the different sections and they're given sections. The most you could give them was firewood. Then what happens? Modernity comes and what we know as the collective is separated because now we have an urban population and we have a rural population. There's a separation. There used to be a time when everybody was together. The ones who were aware was 1, 2, very few people, but largely everybody was together. Suddenly, a whole generation is not only lives in town, is born town. So what happens? The first generation, which is like the generation of my fathers, who stepped out of the village, when they come back now for the funeral, remember they are moved up one class. They are now a middle class. They will have come from working class, rural class. They are now a middle class, which means then they have middle class friends who are friends beyond the tribe, beyond the ethnic demographic, beyond the locational demographic, right? So when the friends would come to support, the idea then originally, this is historical, originally was basically, let me cater for my friends because they don't understand the custom, I'll cater for them. So then what starts out as hospitality, good old hospitality. Wageni wangu wamefika. So what do? I make something small, I take care of them. Change basically then became that, not everybody can cook, people are too tired, it becomes a little bit too heavy. Why don't we get somebody catering? And then that basically evolves into basically a catering industry that comes with all of the negativity that we see with it. But if you look at the roots of it, it came from a place of basically togetherness and collectivity. So the importance for us, I guess, as people going through and people, heads of families, people taking responsibility in various forms of our lives, is that we have to be aware of first how culture is evolving, and secondly, our place in it. Crucial, our place in it, because you are a change agent. How you make decisions will affect the culture of your homestead. Who was the first person? Think about it. Who was the first person in your family line to go to school? You might not know it now, but if you trace it back, you realize it's not too long ago. I can guarantee you it's less than 100 years. Who was the first person in your family to become a Christian? Now you think of yourself as Christians or Muslims, but who was the first one? I can guarantee you again, it's less than 100 years. Culture evolves. So as you stand now, as the person who can see the erosion of culture, who can see negativity, how, in your own terms, based on your own logic, are you shifting the culture? By power of example. What are you doing that's different? What are you doing to counter, to improve? That's the real question. By the way, I'm talking about, my name is Oyunga Pala. I'm the author of this book. Welcome to my live for those who have joined us late. Balok, good to see you. Awanda is here. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm reflecting on the topic today is that what your stories are teaching me about grief, And so we're doing this back and forth. And how this live usually works is that kindly just put your comments and then I'll try and get into them in a kind of very stream of conscious conversation. And if you see something that really strikes you, right, put it down. And if you want to add on to something as well, just put it out there and I'll read it for you. Yeah, like Leslie saying, like people would say, kufa tujue kwenyu, like literally, like we don't know squat about nobody. But the moment he dies, we all arrive there. That's the culture. And we say that's our culture, but it's a very recent culture. It's something that has just evolved with modernity and people living in town and this separation of life and where we don't have real cohesion. We have this kind of professional networks. And anybody who's been employed and fallen out of work knows, when you're employed in a position of security, man, you've got friends like this. The moment that job ends, that title ends, what's the first thing? And Bitang Ndemo, who we know now is the ambassador in Kenya in Brussels and the EU, he's based in Brussels. He wrote this famous article years ago. He used to be the PS for IT, and he lost after the Kibaki era. He lost his job. And what happened after that, man? It's like, he started thinking there's something wrong with his phone. Like, damn, man, nobody's calling me. People are just it's blank. That's exactly what happens. And here's the thing as well. And the same thing that happens with us in terms of, this is why I was saying, when people are sick. When you're truly sick, you want to know your friends? Yeah, just try and fall sick for like about a month. You'll be shocked how many people actually love you. You'll be very surprised. In fact, you'll be shocked by the people who actually show up and stand by your side. Usually the people you hardly ever thought about. That's our reality. That's in a way is our culture. The question is, what are we doing different? How are we challenging? How are we evolving as a people? That's what I'm trying to get through with here. Ja Dala is watching. Good to see you. Collins is here. Oh, man, nice to see you. Collins is an old friend from high school, man. We've got stories with this brother. Yeah, so I've got Domi's here. Domi, nice to see you. I had a comment later. Muzalendo. Oh, those are serious Kenyans, man. Pay attention to Muzalendo. He's been doing some major awakeness way before woke was woke. People like Muzalendo are already telling us what's happening. Anyango is here, and I'd like to read a comment. And she says, if you plan to marry, it's a long comment. So if you plan to marry outside your culture, it's important to discuss the cultural dynamics of significant events, such as marriage, gatherings, and even death with your future spouse. Sharing these traditions is essential, but the couple must also communicate their desire to uphold and participate in these cultures or not. Personally, I understand my cultural practices regarding death, and I've made it clear how I want to be handled when I am gone, which doesn't mean I disregard my heritage. Well, that's deep. That's really deep. Yeah, no, that's a point. That's a point right there. That's your point, Mazir. Dong. That awareness, unfortunately, is not common. It's not common. One of the, and trust me, guys, if you've been to my live before, I plug this book shamelessly. One of the anchor stories in this book is a story of my sister and her wishes at a time of a death, which go completely contrary to our traditional practices. The reason why we're able to even pull it off beyond a lot of other circumstances is because the deceased themselves was very clear what they wanted with the end of life process. Unfortunately for us, not everybody has that level of agency where they can be able to say, hey, by the way, Nikifa, this is what I require you guys to do. This is my will, this is my last testament. For most of us, the moment you die is when you realize actually there were uncles and relatives you didn't even know existed that had amazing authority on decisions of our life. That sometimes is the negative connotations inter-ethnic marriages, which is why I completely agree with Anyango's point when she says that there's a certain degree of openness required when you're getting to a union with somebody, because you can imagine how frustrating it is. For example, if you're a Luo man who's steeped in very deep traditional rituals, or at least a traditional heritage of way of doing things. And suddenly you die. And the famous story we know historically is the story of SM Otieno and Wamboi Otieno. And if those of you who might not know this story, because it's a big case happened in 1984, and it went on for a long month, and it became kind of this court spectacle. It launched the careers of a lot of people, Some of the famous names are still here. Kaminwa, and people like Justice Quach. So what happened though is this SM is this prominent Luo lawyer, SM, and it's kind of considered an urbanite, a man who is, he's just, it's like, what do you call it? He's one of those refined Luos, those Obama-esque types, you know, SOMAD, you know, just, you know, proper professional, all of that. Very progressive, is married a Kikuyu woman, not just any Kikuyu woman, Wamboyo Tieno, who has got serious credentials in terms of her liberation struggles, you know, major force of nature. So what happens? SM dies, I'm not quite sure how SM dies, with a road accident or something, I'm not quite sure. But SM dies, and of course he has his wishes. He had built, SM is originally from a place called Nyalugunga, and of course, like any modern Kenyan, he's built a home elsewhere. So traditionally, people, of course, will build within their own homestead, but as Mark Adero pointed out, is that sometimes you have lack of space. So SM, being progressive, goes and buys land in Ngong, a place called Upper Matasia, and then boom, he builds up, and that technically is his home away from home, but his home. So he dies, and is his last testament. His wife, of course, is the next of kin. Her idea is that I'm burying my husband where? In Upper Matasia. She didn't know she had to contend with Esa Motino's Khan, which was known as Umira Kagera. And so it becomes this big court case of where people are saying, who does SM belong to? It's like SM comes back to the tribe. Then doesn't only belong to the wife. He belongs to the whole collective. Now, if you haven't communicated these things to your better half, you know, perhaps you're one of those modern couples who went and got married at the AGs, you know, and you did it teke. You know, you didn't want any drama. You're trying to keep the cost down. But you haven't communicated that you come from one of those proper Jango clans or one of those Bukusu clans where the elders still have, or Meru clan, the elders still have this outsized authority. The spouse is going to be in serious, and you guys should look up the SM case. It's a beautiful historical record. Huh? You can find it online in very many references. The spouse is going to go through hell. So it's important to communicate these things properly. It's important to have a deeper understanding of your heritage, because you might act here pretending to be like a modern yo-yo person, but point me at the point of death, you'll be shocked by how much of a nini you have. Because at that point, tradition falls back into place. It's what people return to, because it's what gives them a guiding light. And if this is custom, you're likely to fall back into custom. Culture trumps strategy anytime. Always. You might have this great idea, but if the culture is really strong, it'll override everything else. So in a way, I agree largely with what Anyango said, is that clarity is important. You know, write it down, communicate it over and over and over again. One of the greatest lessons of my sister's passing is that she said it over and over and over again. This is what I want. This is what I want. And when it came to crucial decision-making time, her voice carried enough weight for us to apply our wishes as she wanted. Muzalendo has a comment here for me, and it says, Muzalendo says, next time, please mirror the video so that we read. Oh, damn, I'm going to do that, huh? Yeah, somebody told me that. By the way, talking of which, this is, got to show you. This, of course, is Yvonne, Dragonfly Sea. This one, of course, everybody has to read this if you're from Raila Odinga. This is a really good book, by the way. She used to be on CNN, I think BBC later. Zainab Badawi, an African history of Africa. And the point she makes is that African history is pre-colonial. Yeah, exactly. We tend to think of African history as only, when Africa got independence. Africa has been around forever. But we focus on the 1%, you know? And then lastly, because you really asked, I've got a book here. Listen, you know this guy. He's called Kennedy Odede, you know, and Jessica. Kennedy is a famous guy of Shofko, become very famous, incredible story, you know, from literally grass to grace. Yeah, no, but I'll do that next time, you know. I'll remember that, you know. It's a simple tip. I'll remember that. Thank you for the, thank you for that, Mr. Linda. Thank you for that. So, Deborah. Oh, okay, Deborah is on. Don't get me started on politicians in funerals. I once saw a situation where rival groups, Jesus, man, don't get me started either. I once saw a situation where rival groups fought everyone and scampered, leaving the cops. Man, Yeah, you know what? It's sad. It's really sad. You know, I remember a time, and you know, for people like us, you know, we've watched it literally evolve, huh? And I kind of give it like a kind of small evolution of how it went, huh? I remember a time when before like this, you know, like now you look at every funeral and there's this beautiful tents, huh? You know, and everybody comes with the flag poles and boom, 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 boom. Not the ones that look like Ku Klux Klan, you know, costumes, huh? The ones with the tent like that, the white tents we see everywhere now. That's standard, huh? I remember the time when the only thing you'd have is something called a tandarua. Tandarua is Luo for khaki. You know, the tent material. That's all we had. And you had to use you had to cut poles and, you know, and dig them up, you know, and I was about to say sero, which is basically reinforce them with stone so that you could put the khaki over. At a time when there was no PA system, you know, where people would just talk. So I remember when the first PA system started to come, you know, and then I remember then when chiefs, and during now, chiefs started to come to funerals, and this is around during the HIV time, when HIV was, and funerals would be a place now where the chief, typically it would be like, at the end of the funeral, they would say, oh, the chief has an announcement to make, because people are gathered. And the chief would usually be giving a kind of you know, a medical announcement, you know, like, oh, you know, there's a certain treatment, this is happening, and the family would always invite the chief and say, hey, by the way, just come, and the chief is Jedwongo and is here, come and say something. And the guy would say something. Then I remember when the funeral started getting more politicized, and this starts to happen after the death of course there's a whole history, but if you come from my part of that, it starts to come after the death of Robert Ouko, where suddenly, and a lot of people within Nyanza were then in the permanent opposition, you know, just opposition. And so then there was no space for politicians to talk outside of a funeral, because everywhere they went, they would be basically clamped down. So then the funeral then became the place where, for example, the kind of exiled politicians, the real liberation heroes, forget about this shysters now that we have in parliament, would come and then speak to something. More often than not, the politician actually knew the family. Something happened. I'm trying to remember when the transition happened, and somebody from my era can remind me. Something happened around the late 90s, 2000s. As soon as this catering and this perfect tent started to come in, this politicians started to show up, you know? These kinds that, and literally you would find now, I think I remember as little as 3, 4, 5 years ago, it used to become so bad that politicians would shuttle through funerals. And a guy, like, literally in the middle of a funeral, you know, you're there, you're the family. Imagine you're grieving, you're trying to bury, and then before you know it, your funeral has been disrupted. Why? Because a certain politician has come with his whole entourage. And he comes, disrupts the whole funeral, sits there, and then the MC goes out of his way to give him time to speak. And the moment he starts speaking, of course, the podium has to be warmed up. So that's another 10 other people speaking, and they speak nothing to do with the funeral, because they have to appear on TV to score political points. Yeah, man. So there's a lot of erosion that has happened that is now we think as cultural, but these are very recent trends. So part of what I'm trying to do with this book is for us to, as a society, to interrogate what are these things we hold on to, and where do they stem from, and why do we continue to hold on to them, and what are their benefits really? Deborah, thank you so much. That kind of provoked me nicely. But then you can put your questions here, and then I'll just try and get to them. Ashanti, good to see you, man. All the way from Munich. Good to see you. Ashanti's at your game, as I found out, you know. And if you know anything about your game, they're just generally smart guys, huh? So I have no doubt a guy with a name like Ashanti must just be sharp thoroughly. Collins has a comment for me here. He says, real mourning is captured in brokenness, weeping, and sorrowful mood. Eating has less to do with grief. Yeah, you know, I mean, what can you say? What can you say to that? You know, that's really it. You know, that's grief. You know, grief is just, you know, allowing ourselves to be broken. But actually, giving people the space to be. These days, there's less of that. It's like people want to kind of rush through the process very quickly, almost to the point of when it starts becoming too sad, it makes people uncomfortable, so they want to rush you through it quickly. But in the old days, you know, and this is what I used to love about village funerals, is that people are just allowed to wachilia. There's a kind of ugliness of grief. And I remember the early days when I first lost and I didn't know how to surrender to grief. I used to kind of admire those other people. People who could just embody the loss. And that's kind of gone now, and we are so focused on the superficial stuff, but the actual deep stuff, the actual grieving, the actual spiritual connection to what that means to the lost, that's lost. Which is why it's very important for those of us now in positions of leadership in terms of our own families to start to speak very consciously to these issues, right? So that our kids have a proper context of what's going on. So they don't inherit cultures as basically hollow shells, but they inherit cultures as basically systems of navigating life. Culture that is actually potent, not some hollow shell that when you really test it against reality, it holds nothing. So good reflection there, Harrison. Please add your comments here. AING, so I can really respond to them. NG tells me, yeah, you find actually people in school now who basically, it's an industry, catering, it's a death industry. It's like you want to say, in fact, we used to call Jakarta. We used to call them Jakarta, Mago Jakarta. The people who do the catering, and it's an industry. So, and the funny thing, it's an industry that's born of completely capitalistic, and more often than not exploitative. So at the worst time, people who are the most vulnerable, and you look at the funeral cost, the majority of the funeral cost is going into food. For largely strangers, by the way, Nothing wrong with the African custom of hospitality, but there's measures of reality that we must never lose sight of. Yeah? When you're spending that half of your funeral budget to cater for food for 2 days, yet the family is left in destitution, there's something very wrong with that custom. And it needs to be questioned and interrogated. I've got a comment here from Tina Begg. Totally, oh yeah, thank you, Tina. I just spoke about it. I think I must have been late to get to that comment. I just spoke about it, totally agree. Yeah, the famous classic case of Wamboya and SM Otieno, where we have people from two ethnic different groups. As the onus is on the couple. You have to be able to basically communicate this. Say, this is where I come from, these are my family traditions, this is what happens. But you can only do that if you're actually interested in your own heritage. Because the thing is this, and this is why it's important. You can start saying, oh, me, I don't care, this is me, I've moved on, these are not my issues, me squeeze me to modern, mambo ya ocha sitaki. The thing is this, when you die, even your neighbors cannot do anything. They'll say, hey, yeah, we can pretend, but we're their relatives. You will tend to fall back into custom. So if you know this is your reality, then it's really important for you to basically put things down in paper, or at least, at the very least, voice it out. And if you don't know what it is, then at least take the initiative to actually learn. Because the end game here, this is the point I try and reinforce in this book, and I hope it lands, is that life does come to an end. None of us is special. I know you're there thinking, oh, me, I don't know. I've been so good. I eat well. I drink smoothies every morning. Life comes to an end. And we all have to prepare for the end of life process, the end of life transition. And more importantly, we have to be aware of those we leave behind and what we're leaving behind, what kind of situations are we leaving them behind in, especially and most particularly children. Don't go around thinking you're going to be here forever. Won't happen. Omondi has been gracious enough to put his the link to his article, which I encourage everybody to read, The Mercedes Funeral. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece. I read early extracts of it at the beginning of this live. So I'd encourage you guys to come and look at it. Right? Let me read it again. It's called what did you title it, Omondi? It's on Medium. Strength and Sorrow, but I think it's got another one there. Yeah, but he wrote one called Strength and Sorrow. It's on Medium under Omondi Ochuka, and if you look down here, you'll find his Medium link to his page. The Mercedes Funeral, of course, is the famous thing written by, was it Ngugi? Was it Ngugi? I think it was Ngugi, yeah? Ngugi Wa Thiong'o, who writes about the Mercedes Funeral. If you've never read about the Mercedes Funeral, you should just look it up. It's a classic that critiqued this thing way then. The idea is that somebody's a poor man, you're just there, everybody ignores you, and the moment you die, suddenly you're in a suit, you're mheshimiwa, you're the nani, everything, nini, As I said, we love the dead. The living, not so much. D.A. Oyugi has something to say. They say, on the shifting culture, specifically on matters of burial and funerals, I think the next front, especially among the Luo, would be on issues of unmarried women or divorced women. It will be interesting to see the changes in culture around burial of that category of women. Wow. You gotta read my book, Oyugi. I'm ahead of my time. You gotta read my book. I confront this thing, as I say, mundo homundo, head on. I confront it head on. And that's the idea. There's an ideal, and within a cultural ideal is that every woman is going to get married to a respectable home, and they'll be situated within that home, I come from a generation of mothers who came from elsewhere. They situated in new places and built entire families off of it, So I know that. But at the same time, I have now a huge collective of cousins, female cousins, who are not in what we call traditional marriages. Then they are unmarried, they are single mothers, they're separated, they're divorced. Solid women, right? The way the culture has dealt with them over the years, varying degrees of separation, but I can say for our parts, and largely, and this is really I think this is our privilege, at least as a family, is that, which is why I say culture is basically malleable. It changes. Because my eldest aunt, when she died, she set a precedent that had never been set in the family. She decided that she was going to be cremated. And since she had organized everything in such a way that nobody could really go against it, it became a precedent, and she forced the entire family to think twice against how they deal with women. And since it wasn't culturally, located, people had to adjust. And now, for example, we within at least the family system, all of the women who were unmarried, who were single mothers, we bury them back at home. This, unfortunately, I must say, is not custom for everybody, right? There's such a thing as certain women, when it comes to a point of death, wanatemwa, There's cases I've had of even separated husbands saying, I don't want this woman buried here, bury her elsewhere else. There's lots of cases like that. Tragic, which is why I'm saying, as a collective, as a people, we have to make some of these decisions. You'll be shocked, you are the culture now, Yes, there's certain aspects that are very powerful, but don't forget the kind of agency you have, especially as men who have agency. If you have sisters, don't be that kind of guy who, you have sisters, you have daughters. Don't be the kind of guy who it has to happen to you in order for you to see the sense of it. If you have sisters, you have daughters, you have mothers. Think. Be careful about the collective tendency to fall back on aspects of fear, confusion, and ignorance. Think. Think about the decisions you're making and the implications for the future. Think. Very important. I've seen such rivalries, such conflict, such inconsiderateness, insensitivity during times of tragedy. For people who are really close, literally siblings, but how they treat each other is terrible. It's terrible. So these are issues that we really have to pay attention to very deeply. So thank you, D.A. Oyugi, for kind of bringing that up. Kerubo makes a point. Thank you for this very important conversation. The questions that emerge for me is, how can we grieve and support, let me read that properly, how can we grieve and support those who are grieving from a place of Utu, embodied dignity and care? Ooh, that's a beautiful question. This is what I've learned. You know, one must learn to speak from their lived experience. This is what I've learned. One of the most important things for me, as somebody who's been in a position of grief, and you know, because then once you've been in those shoes, it's a lot easier to say, oh, I wish people showed up in this way, you know. So one of the most important things for me was the idea of presence. This idea that, you know what, people just showing up and staying. I've written a poem, which I encourage you guys to go read, you know, and I call it The Alchemy of Brotherhood. And it's a tribute to all of my brothers, and I talk about brothers collectively, all of those men in my lives who over the course of my life have stood for me in times of deep stress, deep sorrow, you know, have stood alongside me. And largely the thing that I've learned from their large lesson, if I was to kind of synthesize it down to the essence, is presence. The ability to be present and to be non-judgmental. It's amazing. Just the ability to just show up and just show up and stay. You know? And to, you know, sometimes when somebody's in a point of deep distress, they say some really crazy things, they have some really crazy expectations, but the ability just to sit with them. I remember, I'll give you a case in point. When my old man passed, when my dad died, and this was, what was I, 15, 16 years old, 15 actually, complete confusion. So this is the first time I'm realizing how long a funeral process takes, you know? So typically, you know, you think, oh, somebody dies, you know, like if it was Islam, you know, 2-3 days is done. But this one, of course, the whole process is taking like 2 weeks, you know, because it's a big man, you know, people have to get organized, and of course, long before I understood what it took to actually bury an individual, you know, within a community setup. So it's taking a long time. So we have days, you know, like a week plus, you know, before the actual thing. So there's everything happening here, but as a kid, what do? You know what I mean? Your whole idea is that you're supposed to be sad, but you can't be sad all the time. You know what I mean? You can't be sad all the time. So I really didn't know what to do, you know. So everything else is going, and typically what happens when you're younger is you completely get forgotten. Because everybody kind of deals with other things, you know, but you're just like, okay, the most they ask you is that, is it Chiemo? Have you eaten? That's pretty much the most they ask you. But in terms of how you're feeling, all of that stuff, you completely get forgotten, which is why I'm saying, if you're going through a funeral process, please pay attention to the children. Pay attention to the children. They completely get forgotten. Completely, you know? So I was just I didn't know what to do with my time. I didn't know what to do. And I remember one cousin did something really interesting for me, and I remember to this date. He took me to the cinema. I thought it was the most illicit thing that somebody could do, you know, like take you to, your dad has died, it's supposed to be mourning, you're going to watch a movie. It was the most, I remember to date now, this is, God, almost 40 years now, 89, you know. He took me to cinema because he was paying attention. He saw my situation, he saw what was happening, he gave me, and for that moment, for that 2 hours, we were watching that movie. I wasn't like, it was in Kisumu. So they have this Indian cinema, you know, there's a guy called Amitabh Bachchan. If you ever watch Slumdog Millionaire, they reference him a lot. And Amitabh Bachchan, famous like Utero of the Indian cinema. Big name. We went and watched an Amitabh movie, you know, in Kisumu, a place used to be called Tivoli. Can you imagine? So pay attention. So one of the things that I say is that from the Utu aspect is that the idea is that your loss is my loss. So I sit with you. And I sit with you not to hurry you through it, but to sit alongside you. And if you stand, we stand with you. You sit down, we stand with you. Until a point when I see that, you've come to a point of relief. This is the one thing I've treasured. And I write a poem to attribute to all of my named and unnamed brothers who consciously and unconsciously did this for me. And this is what I call the Utu embodied dignity. I like the word. Utu embodied dignity, of where you stay, you support, you see the humanity of the other, and you stick with it. I hope that kind of helps, Kerubo. It's almost coming to 9. Usually I do this thing for like about 1.5 hours, so I tend to wrap up at the top of the hour. So that's a kind of few more questions. And by the way, if you have anything you want to say, please put it in the comment box. Huh? We're doing reflections from my writing process, Strength and Sorrow. My name is Oyunga Pala, in case you're joining us for the first time. And I'm just saying what your stories are mirroring back on me, and now I'm responding to comments from people in the comment box. Huh? So Bet tells me this. Nyangis truly anchored the book. I love the story and love. Oh, thank you so much. Oh, thank you, Bet. That's really nice of you. You know, yeah, that's really nice. I'd like to hear what people think as well of the stories within it. But ultimately, for me, what this book is an attempt to do is that it really is in three parts. You know, allow me to plug it again. It really is in three parts. The first part is basically my first encounter with death, which is why it's just like, boutoir. We used to have that word, boutoir. Nilishukona boutoir. You know, I love that expression. Huh? Because it's just, you're bamboozled, you're confused, you have no idea what to do. You're just like, what the hell just happened? What do I do? What's going to happen to my life? I don't know. Disruption. Nobody had told me about this possibility. What do you mean he died? What's the plan? What goes on? What do I do with my life after this? That first confusion. Then somewhere in the middle, when I'm in my 30s, my older brother dies. And that was just painful, you know, like, because this is a companion, this is your boy, this is your guy, you're growing old together, you know, like yeah, man, Johnny, Monty is like my guy, you know, like like, you're guaranteed somebody, I mean, the whole world could be against you, but you know that brother of yours will show up and he won't ask, he'll just punch the next guy. Then that guy goes, and you're just like, damn. There's a kind of aloneness that you're left with of just, and it's a kind of strange anger, because it's a suppressed anger. You're angry at the world, you're angry at life, you're angry at all of these things, but you can't quite express it. So what do? I only know stoicism, which is, you know, be a man, do what needs to be done, show up, you know, protocol, observe protocol. By the time it gets to the end of the book, which is now, so my father, my brother, my sister. This is how I anchored the book. And by the time my sister comes, because, as Umondi Ochuka writes, it's a long-drawn process of an illness, so you can anticipate death. And as anticipating death, and she has a kind of terminal illness where she could die at any point, so you're forced to confront the possibility that she's going to die. And what even makes it more kind of difficult and more confronting is the person in that state of distress is now telling you, oh, by the way, OP, as she used to call me, you know, this thing could just turn to me and I could be gone. And what do you say to that? You know, Genie says, what do you say to that? You're like, what do you say? Oh yeah, I don't, be strong, you know, be courageous. The Lord is there. We know we shall continue to pray. Yeah, yada, 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 yada. Beautiful. The person going through it is facing their own reality. They have confronted their own reality. What do you do as the person supporting them? Now, one of the things I learned, and I try and explain this in the book, is the ability just to sit with my uncomfortableness, with my worry, with my confusion, all of those things, but to sit with it and not try and run away from it. Because the person who is in the pits of this distress is showing courage. It doesn't help at all if all you're doing is bringing worry to the table. If all you're bringing is just your worries. So the person who is sick in bed dying is worried about your anxiety. They're so worried about your anxiety that they're trying to stay alive for you. This is what I learned not to do, because it's an incredible burden on the person in distress. So the ability to sit, the ability to stand alongside, the ability to support without necessarily yapping. Just the power of presence is the understated force that makes all the difference. That's it. It's the understated force, which is why I say it's something that if you have the privilege of being in a position like that, please pay attention to it. It goes way beyond the money. You can give all of the money you want, but trust me, when you're at the graveside, you want to look around, and you want to see your people. When you're starting to read the eulogy and you break down, you want to hope that somebody's going to come from the crowd and put a hand on your shoulder and just say, not saying not much, Just look at you in the eye and nod back and say, we're here. You want that, you know? That has been my lesson. I'll take a few more questions. Anyango is saying something, and sometimes the deals would, oh man, Anyango, you must be from my era, man. You must be from my era. Sometimes the DO, remember you guys remember something called a DO? I mean, Gen Zs wouldn't know what that is. A district officer, and he used to wear this kind of bakulis and khaki shirt. Have a lot of, it takes a lot of power. You know, this driving Land Rovers mostly. Yeah, the guy would show up and go on something completely different with the morning. The guy could even literally disrupt the funeral and shut it down. That's how powerful they were. Times have changed, people. Times have really changed. Beth has something here. In your situation of life now, which funeral rites would you preserve? Which one would you discard, and why? Ooh, that's a big question. That's a big question. First of all, it's difficult to. It's a big question, but I'll try and kind of answer it as. I'll say what contextually, basically. What I'll try to do is contextually. One of the things, and especially if I do a comparative study between, say, funeral practices in Europe and from what I know in Africa, one of the things I really love about the grieving process at home is the community. The idea that if I had a funeral today, even neighbors who didn't particularly like me, you know, will show up out of courtesy. That understanding, you know, even relatives who couldn't stand me will show up out of courtesy, out of obligation. That is a beautiful tradition. I would hate to lose it. You know, the idea that if I passed on, my kids wouldn't have to worry because all of my cousins and all of my aunties and all of the people I love back would feel it is their responsibility to take care of business. That is a beautiful aspect, right? So that collective, that communalism, that ability to mourn in communion, it's a very powerful thing. In the West, you tend to, you know, you do an individual grieving process and then you go see a therapist, which is what a series of sessions, which supposedly help you overcome your grief. A lot of times it's just illusionary. At the best, it's just a balm. But the idea that you grieve in communion over a long time and you stay with the grief, that is a beautiful process that I like. The other thing that we have, as people of African heritage, is that our funerals have a spiritual basis. You know, have a deep spiritual basis. We're not just disposing a body, you know, putting a body away, a carcass. No, we speak to soul. We speak to, you know, what happens to the soul after the body is disintegrated. You know, so that aspect is really powerful because it takes us beyond the realm of reason. Because when you can't make sense of the tragedy and harshness of death, you need to fall back on a spiritual grounding. And this is the one thing I tell, especially men. You need some version of a spiritual foundation. Something. I mean, it doesn't have to be prescriptive. But please fall back on something. Something that has a divine correlation. Because trust me, the nature of life is to slam people sideways in ways that cannot make any sense. In ways that can sometimes be incredibly cruel. And if you can't contextualize this thing from within a divine paradigm, and if you can't have the ability to surrender to some of these forces of life that basically flatten us, irrespective of how high we've risen, then you can basically sink into deep depression. So one of the things that I really like about our funeral process is that they have an undercurrent spiritual aspect. The idea that people don't quite just die, you know? They transition, they move into a different form. The thing that I keep on harping about, David Beattie's famous term, the living dead. The idea that our dead are living because we remember them, because we keep on talking about them. In a way, this book is literally a tribute to my living dead, our living dead. And that's what I'm doing, you know. The fact that we talk about them keeps them alive and they become a real presence. And so these people who were supposedly dead end up being my greatest teachers. So those are two like really strong aspects, I would say. The thing that I'd like to get rid of, if I could get it, is just this extravagance of funerals, that has come in lately. Because I've seen it happen in my lifetime, the extravagance of funerals, literally in the last 20 years. That I wish we could tone down on, yeah? And, and go back into basic, simple processes of what it takes to help somebody transition in the end-of-life process. Okay, I'll take the last two, then I really have to get out of here. Collins has, he has a nice long comment for me. Let me read this for you guys. And Collins Harrison says, I'm married from South Sudan, I suppose a lady from South Sudan, and I admire their conduct of funeral ceremonies. Upon passing on, the dead is interred immediately. Then a 40 days of mourning follows, and on the 40th day, a closure ceremony is held, and it is that point where the mourners come with assorted food from their homes and share. It is during this ceremony where the eulogy is done. The ceremony comes with a modest budget and less intrusive to the bereaved. Such practice is admirable, and to help people gradually, oh man, that is a sophisticated, modern, ooh. I didn't even realize this. You're going to tell me, Collins, I'm going to ask you this maybe privately, which community in South Sudan this comes from, huh? Because I know the Muslims also have the 40-day grieving period. It sounds very kind of Islamic. So you're going to tell me which particular it is. But that's a beautiful ceremony. And you can see what they're doing right there. I mean, it's the logical sequence is right there, The body is done, because of processes, expenses and everything. Put the body away. Give people time to grieve. Give it time. Because what you're doing with the 40 days is that you're conscious that you're grieving. You're conscious that you're grieving. I think even in the Buddhist tradition, they have about the same time, 40 days of mourning. So you're conscious that you're grieving. You're conscious that, and in a way, by then conscious, you're actually supporting the people who are bereaved. And at the end of it, at the end of the 40 day, have what you call now the real funeral, because you've allowed yourself to surrender to grief that allows you now to properly reflect on the loss. I think that's a really beautiful tradition. And thank you for sharing it. Please tell me from exactly what ethnic or cultural group it is from. So, let me finish this by saying, Kerubo has something else here. She's saying, Keruba Bua says, beautiful explanation and exploration and explanation. Absolutely. It's about showing with intention to be present, stand in solidarity from a place of soul-to-soul connection, love and care. The authentic, I see you. That's it, man. I see you. And I see you doesn't need to be said. You show, you don't tell. You don't tell people, I see you, nakuona dadi, nakuona. No. You show up. You show up. And you stand. And you stay. That's the important thing. Yeah, thank you so much for this. Huh? Thank you. Duncan K. Senior, Kenya Senior tells me, Ohinga, thank you for sharing and putting sorrow and strength in print so that we can learn and unlearn from experiences. And ask, I've got the book from, oh yeah, thank you. I got the book from Nuria Bookstore. I would like to autograph it for me. I intend to keep it as a sentimental and keep it as a reference book for me and my family. Please guide me on how I can get it autographed. I'll be coming home very soon, huh? So I'll make a big announcement about what do you call it? About signing. I'd love to do that. It's the classmate. It will be my honor to autograph your books, So I'll be coming to Nuri actually to do some autograph signings. But I'll dedicate a whole week to that, and hopefully as life goes on, I'll be in a position to do a lot more autographs. But thank you so much for the compliment. Thank you so much for just sharing that, and for the honor, Thank you so much. Huh? Anyango Nyakach, yeah, I get it. Kerubi says, it takes embracing vulnerability, uncertainty, ambiguity, and the complexity of grief and loss. Ooh, I like how you write, Kerubo. And loss, letting the unknown emerge and just to be within care and compassion for self and others. Beautifully said, nothing to add there. Beautifully said. And Collins tells me that particular culture we're talking about was the Bara community, and specifically the Mahdi. Ah, that's good. I'll read up on that. Yeah, thank you so much. The Mahdi. Southern Sudan, because I know there's a lot of, it's a big ethnic groups there. No, thank you. I'll read up on that. That's a beautiful culture. It reminds me a lot of the Islamic culture as well. Huh? So, in conclusion, I want to say thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for joining me in this live. You know, people who have stayed, who are here all the time, people like Henry Pelfs. Thank you so much for just, just for supporting the work, I hope you get a chance to buy the book. I hope you get a chance to read it, reflect on it. And I hope it, it becomes a companion in your life, helps you reflect on these bigger issues, and, just generally learn from the ones that we have lost. I try and do this every Thursday. So please show up, usually at 8:30 EAT. I also regularly blog. So if you go to my website, you'll find I do a weekly post. A lot of it are reflections on grief and loss. That's been what I've been writing around this season. So you'll get a much more expanded version of the different reflections and meditations I have on this subject. So I am on Substack, I'm on LinkedIn, I am on Instagram, I'm on TikTok, surprise, surprise, surprise. And what else? Yeah, and of course, Facebook as a native site, So thank you so much for your time, guys. I need to sign out. This particular live will still be available on my timeline. So if you want to go back to it, just throw in a comment. I'll try and respond to it. But for now, I say shukran, as Keruba says. Shukran back. Thank you so much, everybody who got a chance. Collins, it was beautiful to see you. Anyango, man, thank you so much. That's some deep insight. Duncan, I appreciate everything, and all of the people who had time to be here with me today. Thank you so much. Stay well, and we'll see you next week. Take it easy.